"You will not last a day," the housekeeper said when the gate clicked behind me. 24 hours earlier, I had nothing but a duffel bag and a last notice taped to our apartment door. My mother needed surgery, my sister needed tuition, and an eviction notice with a stamped date sat like a threat on the table. I answered an ad that promised room and steady pay and figured it was a lie. It was the only gamble I could take. The estate rose from the road like a polished island, marble steps reflecting a late sun and hedges clipped with the kind of precision money buys. A bell chimed somewhere deep inside as the intercom clicked my name. Mrs. Hayworth opened the front door before I could knock. She smelled of lemon oil and old linen. Her look measured me as if I were an ingredient. "You will not last a day," she said, and then she let me through. Inside, the air was a blend of dustless citrus, a faint trail of espresso and varnish, and old photographs on the mantel, one showing a man smiling into a light I could not read. In the study, he waited, all angles and silk and the faint scent of cedar. He asked why he should hire me, as if the question could be solved with a ledger. I told him I had to be paid. He said 33 nannies had come before me and none had stayed. I told him I would stay. If you like stories about a precarious latch between need and belonging, subscribe and stay. 24 hours before the bell, I was someone else. I grew up in a small apartment that hummed with too many bodies and too few mattresses. My childhood smelled of boiled rice, bleach, and my mother returning from 3 jobs with a jacket that still held the subway cold. Lena, my sister, and I shared a narrow bed, trading study notes and whispered plans under a light bulb. School felt like a promise I could not afford to break. My mother Rosa worked afternoons at a clinic, evenings at a bakery, and on Sundays at a textile workshop. She taught me to count change until the numbers meant survival. I left school early to work, a courier job that left my hands rough and my back hungry. I learned to soothe children on buses, to silence a wail with a song, to cradle a fevered forehead with the hesitant tenderness of someone who had not been taught how to be loved. When the eviction notice came, it was the last straw. I answered ads that said live in, room provided, desirable candidate only. One asked for references, another wanted full background checks, another said they had had 33 nannies and none had worked out. I lied on a few forms and told the truth on others. I needed the job more than I needed my pride. The smell of disinfectant and hospital corridors had become familiar because of Mom, because of the diagnosis they had given her a month before. I shelled out the last of my cash for an interview suit and told Lena to keep the light on. The night before I left, I packed a small bag of things that reminded me of home. A worn bookmark, a chipped mug that said hope, a photograph of Mom with a bruise on her smile. I said goodbye to the apartment that had been my whole life with the same raw gratitude you might say to a person who has taught you everything, then left. I carried the eviction notice folded like an accusation. My need for steady pay was not abstract. It was a body in the hospital, a calendar of due dates, a mouth waiting for surgery. That necessity was the engine that pushed me up the marble steps and through the big front door. The interview itself felt like a test curated in marble. Miguel, the house manager, greeted me with the precise politeness of someone trained to remove discomfort from rooms. He guided me to a study where heavy drapes kept the light cool and a terrarium of succulents sat like a green constellation. The man who would be my employer watched with a calm that bordered on disinterest. He introduced himself as Mr. Archer, a name said like a fact and not a conversation. His voice was even, controlled. He asked quick questions about my experience, about how I handled crises, about bedtime routines and diet restrictions. I answered and added small details: how to braid hair in the dark, how to trick a toddler into medicine with a spoonful of honey and a story. He watched my hands while I spoke, as if they told a ledger he could read. Halfway through, Mrs. Hayworth, the head housekeeper, entered with a tray of tea and a look that cooled the room. She said we had taken 33 nannies through the threshold, and none lasted past a week. He said that the children were not ordinary, that they tested boundaries like scientists testing a hypothesis. Then the younger man who brought the children's laundry poked his head in and said dinner would be ready in an hour. The conversation fractured into the logistics of staff, the cameras in the corridors, the protocol for visitors, the list of rules tacked to the back of a clipboard. At one point, Mr. Archer asked me what I would do if a child refused to eat, and I answered with a story of a boy who would not sleep until someone sang him the same song his mother used to sing. He paused, and for the first time, I saw something like interest, like a crack in the armor. That crack was small, but it was wide enough to walk through. Mrs. Hayworth said the children would meet me that night. Miguel showed me to a small study, but tastefully furnished room in the east wing with a view of a private garden that smelled of wet earth and jasmine. The house felt alive and impossible at once. They were four in a way that was immediate and chaotic. The quadruplets arrived like a single organism that split into shrieking, gorgeous parts. There was Theo, oldest by minutes, with a brow that furrowed like a man who thought very fast. Jonah had a penchant for mischief, laugh lines already forming in a boy's face. Nico watched like a cat, measuring angles and exits. And Elias clung to the hem of a sweater like a shadow that refused to be left alone. The first test was dinner. The table was set with silver so bright it made the mashed potatoes look like soft clouds. The children took turns launching challenges, a volley of questions about where I had come from, what I ate for breakfast, whether I was allergic to dogs, whether I believed in monsters. Their voices overlapped. Little rituals tested me, a plate left momentarily untouched, a spoon placed upside down, a stare that lasted a beat too long. I had been warned in whispers by the butler and by the laundry boy about clocks that changed rules, and a father who observed rather than intervened. The exchange across the table stretched into something else. It was a conversation in which I had to show not only competence, but a willingness to be vulnerable. I read them a story about a kite that lost its string, and how the wind taught it new ways to land. Jonah scoffed. Theo asked about the kite's fear. Nico wanted to know if it could be fixed, and Elias fell asleep mid-page and rested his head on my arm. Mr. Archer watched from the doorway. He had the kind of face made for columns and reserved donations. He spoke little that night, but when he did, his words were measured. He asked what I would do if one of them started to pull people away with anger, as if testing whether love can be hoarded. I said I would ask questions and not assume. That answer earned a look that warmed the room by degrees. Later, Mrs. Hayworth caught me in the kitchen and said, "They will test you in games and nights, but you will also teach them to trust if you can sit still with their storms." Her hand brushed mine briefly, and the touch felt like a benediction. The next week was a curriculum of small wars and quiet triumphs. Days began with cereal and a barrage of demands, and ended with the soft collapse into pajamas and bedtime stories. I cataloged incidents like a ledger. On Tuesday, Jonah painted the wallpaper with black ink and blamed an imaginary friend. On Wednesday, Theo locked himself in the library and handed me a packet of torn drawings as if they were proofs of a conspiracy. Nico staged a hunger strike for cookies, and Elias mastered the art of hiding to perfection. Each day was a test with new rules. I learned to turn punishment into tasks that taught responsibility rather than shame. I cooked meals with spices that reminded the children of afternoon markets, and I read them books in voices that could be ridiculous and grave in the same paragraph. Miguel taught me where the quiet spaces were in the house and gave me a list of emergency contacts. Jonas, the family lawyer, dropped off forms about guardianship and privacy and asked me to initial them. Ava Kendrick, the woman who ran Archer Holdings and who had once been engaged in a rumor of a deal with Mr. Archer, arrived one afternoon and watched the children with a glance that weighed them from market potential. She asked questions in conference room tones about logistics and return on investment. The staff on duty included Marcus, the groundskeeper, Dr. Chen, the pediatric consultant they consulted sometimes, Lila, the tutor, and Hannah, the nursery nurse who had started the laundry rotation. Over plate after plate, I stitched my small wins into a pattern. One night, Theo handed me a crumpled Matchbox car and whispered that he had once had a mother who drove him to the beach. I did not ask which mother. I fixed the car, and he hugged me like a person who had found a harbor. There were minor victories in dominoes and in a child finally agreeing to eat peas. There were also setbacks, which I logged and repaired with apologies that were honest. The pattern built trust like mortar. Around the end of the second week, a woman named Ava Kendrick returned with press attachments and a poise that suggested she negotiated empires and outcomes rather than feelings. She offered Mr. Archer a business opportunity that smelled like exile and compromise at once. It was a proposition wrapped in figures that promised to simplify his life. Her proposal was glamorous and immaculate, and it came with a spreadsheet that made choices look clean. She said that a living arrangement could become an official program, a public narrative, a project that restored reputations and increased influence. Her questions slid between concern and calculation. Mr. Archer listened. He had been quiet about the day his husband died and about the shuttered parts of his heart. Ava suggested restructuring staff, outsourcing childcare to an institute for elite children, opening the house to a social project that doubled as PR. Her offer included a sum that would cover my mother's surgery and months of security. The very thing I wanted emerged as a temptation to be used as a wedge. The house hummed with the practicalities of shift changes and the promise of money that could erase my debts. That night, I heard Mr. Archer in his study making a phone call, his voice flat, then a long silence. The words of Ava echoed, "Protection for the children is cheaper when it is predictable." I understood what her offer meant. It meant control. The proposal planted a seed of doubt in the air like dust in a sunbeam. There was an argument that took place in a series of looks and half-sentences that night between Miguel and Mrs. Hayworth and the nursery staff. They were afraid of losing intimacy if childcare became a machine. I was afraid of losing the chance to save my mother. That fear weighed on me like an unspoken ledger. There were moments that tightened my chest and made decision into an ache. One of them was when I found Theo alone in the winter house he had locked himself in. He sat on the cold stone floor with his knees up and a smear of dried chocolate on his lip. His eyes looked small and old. He told me, without a preface, that he had been measuring who stayed and who left, and he had charts in his head. When I asked what he would do if everyone left, he said he would make himself small enough to be invisible. My throat closed. I sat down and put my palm on the floor near his and told him a truth about invisibility, about how sometimes being seen felt dangerous, but that the world could be negotiated with small acts of courage. I said I could hide with him, and we could count the tiles together until his fear lost its edges. He listened like a judge listening to a confession, and then he let out a laugh that sounded like it surprised him. That laugh broke something in me. I realized that staying was no longer only about money or survival, but about the promise I could make to those 4 lives. Another moment of tension came when Ava left an envelope on the study desk and asked me to sign a non-disclosure as a courtesy. The envelope contained an offer that could fix my finances and remove the daily presence of the children from my obligations. Mr. Archer found the envelope and looked at me over it with an expression that mixed curiosity and pain. My fingers hovered, and I felt each choice as a physical thing, a stone on my tongue. I could sign and leave with enough to fix our medical bills and find a small apartment, or I could refuse and continue to be unpaid in the currency of intimacy. I sat at the dining table and watched the children construct a tower from teacups and decided to test my own math. My heart knocked against my ribs like a measured pulse and then slowed. In another tension, the oldest of the children, Jonah, broke into the private cabinets and ate an entire jar of preserves and blamed Elias. The fight that followed was loud and raw, and I had to be the breaker and the healer both. I soothed, I listened while each child told their version, and I taught them how to name the thing beneath the anger. These moments required that I be more than a worker. They demanded that I be a witness. At the 30% mark of my time in the house, I want to pause and invite you into something that matters. If this part of the story touches you, I want to hear from you. Tell me about a time when you had to choose between what was safe and what was right. Start your comment with the words "I chose," and then tell us why. Your voice matters here, because these stories are not only mine, they belong to a community who has lived through impossible choices and gentle mercies. Share a short sentence about a small victory that changed everything for you. Your comment might help someone else decide to stay, to leave, to forgive, or to demand better. We read every message and carry them with us when we write. If you want to support more stories like this, a short comment and a like helps us reach others who need soft, stubborn tales of belonging. Now, back to the house. The house was a map of potential conflicts. In one kitchen episode, Mr. Archer and I argued about rules and permission and what constituted parenthood in practice. He believed in boundaries defined by policy, cameras, and logs. I believed in the messy work of staying. We had a long conversation in the corner of the kitchen with steam rising and the scent of rosemary baking in the oven. He asked why I refused the legal protections Ava offered. I said that a contract that asked me to step away from the children in exchange for money felt like an erasure. He said he was tired of performers who smiled on camera and left when the lights went out. Our dialogue stretched into exchanges where we circled the word family and tried to define it. He said that his life had been hardened by loss, that he had folded himself into numbers because numbers did not betray. I told him that some promises cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. The conversation grew into a negotiation where sheets and pillows and toys were traded as metaphors for safety. Miguel intervened with a practical plan to rearrange schedules to create more stability and less public exposure. It felt like the first real attempt at structural compromise. Across the weeks, small rituals became our language. I learned how he liked his coffee, how he left a particular magazine face down to avoid gossip. He learned to ask the children about their day and to hide his surprise when Jonah told a joke and made him laugh. The household settled into a rhythm that allowed room for both caution and softness. Pressure mounted when my mother was scheduled for surgery and Ava resurfaced with a new angle that made my feet tingle as if standing on a precipice. Her new proposal involved turning some childcare into a branded philanthropic program that would give the Archer name charity optics and would standardize care. It promised funding that would keep the hospital bills paid for months. She arrived with charts and a smile that did not reach her eyes and asked me privately if I had considered the security of being financial independent. I told her the truth, that I had never been free of worry long enough to imagine a safety net. She called me brave and pragmatic in the same sentence and offered to help me with my mother's expenses if I would record an interview about the difficulties of working in high-net-worth households as part of the campaign. That night, as I folded tiny pajamas for the children, I imagined my mother in a hospital bed without me there to settle her, and I thought of the quiet ledger of debts that sat like a second skin. Mr. Archer found me in the nursery and said he had been offered a corporate partnership with Ava that would shift the way the household functioned. He looked tired. He asked me to consider my options as if he were offering me a consultation and not a favor. My answer would be a declaration about where my loyalties lived. The crisis that defined the arc happened on a rainy morning when an envelope was placed gently on my pillow with my name on it. Inside were figures and a plane ticket and a contract that made being part of a program sound charitable and neat. The offer was a clean excision of responsibility, a removal of the messy tether. I sat with the paper and felt each clause like a small frost on the skin. Signing meant paying for my mother's surgery and leaving the children to a schedule measured in efficiency. Refusing meant continuing in a household of emotional labor without the guarantee that the next month would be covered. I walked through the house in the rain and thought of the 4 small faces that had anchored me. Jonah and Theo and Nico and Elias had learned to expect me at certain hours and told secrets into the seams of my jacket. I sat at the library desk where the photograph of the smiling man rested, and I thought about the photograph being a promise interrupted. My inner monologue became a long argument about duty and desire. The tension in my chest was physical. I wrote a list of costs and a list of reasons to stay. The weight of the lists made my hands tremble. When Mr. Archer knocked on the library door and asked quietly what I had decided, I felt the moment stretch like breath before a plunge. We had a conversation that began as negotiation and ended in confession. He said I was reckless and brave in the same sentence. I told him I could not take the money and leave, that I had discovered a thing inside me that would not let the children be reorganized into a program. I said I had promised my mother that I would find a way, and that I could not promise to both her and the children unless they were allowed to exist together. He listened with a stillness that made me imagine he had been listening to the wrong things for a long time. Then he did what surprised me. He unfolded his hands and told me about the night the house became mine to manage in the wake of loss. He told me he had been counting days like coins and had mislaid the language of tenderness the way one misplaces a book. I laughed then, because it was absurd to laugh at the theater of emotions happening in a marble room. He asked what I wanted, really. I told him I wanted to be paid enough for my mother and to have a contract that guaranteed me safe housing and a living wage, and a clause that allowed me to be here if I chose. He asked if I wanted more, and I said I wanted people to stop thinking of the children as projects. He admitted he had been offered by Ava a corporate solution that would have made his life easier. He asked me if I would stay as an equal, not a placeholder. The negotiation that followed was both practical and human. Miguel drew up a schedule, Jonas drafted a clause to protect our privacy and my role, and Mr. Archer committed to fewer cameras in the nursery and more dinner evenings when he would be present. After the confession came the small, clumsy rituals of newness. We signed papers that made sense in law and in love. Jonas oversaw a clause that guaranteed wages, housing, and a small fund for emergencies that required medical and logistical transparency. The legal description of the arrangement was a tidy paragraph in a file, but it did not contain the moments that mattered. The moments that mattered were the accidental touches at the piano while teaching the children a lullaby, the way Mr. Archer learned to ask what day it was and to celebrate the small milestones with juvenile enthusiasm, the way Jonah started to leave little drawings in the kitchen for me to find. We built a family out of negotiations and dinners and the repetition of small mercies. I taught them how to make a bread that rose slow and patient, and one day Mr. Archer tasted it and said it was a good loaf, which in his voice was high praise. The house no longer felt like a fortress, but a weathered book with notes in the margins. We read bedtime stories that rotated authors and languages. On a rainy Sunday, we made a fort from sheets, and it became an embassy of secrets. There were technical things we did that made the arrangement sustainable. The legal paperwork Jonas prepared included guardianship, clarifications, non-disclosure specifics that protected the household from outside exploitation, and a clause that guaranteed a minimum income and housing for me. The medical process for my mother required a pre-surgery assessment, insurance appeals, and a scheduling of the procedure, which Dr. Chen and the hospital team handled with efficiency. I submitted the necessary documentation, filled forms, and arranged transport. The surgery itself was scheduled after insurance approved the appeal, which took 3 days of calls and a meeting with the hospital administrator. The descriptions of the steps were mundane but precise and gave a sense of security to everyone involved. There were moments of tension after the agreement that demanded further proof of trust. One night, a rumor started in the servants' circle that Ava might sabotage our arrangement by creating press interest, and a staff meeting punctuated by raised voices ensued. Miguel negotiated duties and reassured staff. Marcus fixed a fence that had split in the storm, and Hannah organized a roster that shared night work more fairly. The children watched the staff talk and learned how to solve disputes without tearing down the other side. Over time, their tests turned from cruelty into curiosity. Jonah learned that asking for a thing and waiting politely often yielded results, and that being clever could be used to help others. Theo turned his meticulousness into drawings that became a scrapbook of our days. Nico discovered that language could be a key to unlocking people and used it to become a storyteller. Elias stopped hiding and began to leave small soft toys in places for his siblings. The house evolved from a place of trials into a place where waiting had purpose. 1 month later, the house felt simultaneously the same and new. My mother had recovered from her surgery and sat at a window each morning with a mug that steamed the cold air. I had a drawer with my own things in the east wing and a list of duties that came with paid leave and benefits. The children had a routine that included a shared chore chart and an hour of storytelling time at dinner. Mr. Archer had fewer meetings and more afternoons where his presence was simply physical, not strategic. I had time to attend a community class on childcare regulation and learn some technical terms that gave me new confidence. The quotidian joys were small: a perfect pancake sundae, an impromptu rain dance in the courtyard, a letter from Lena, who had enrolled back at evening classes because my steady wages let her. The old photograph in the study gained another photo beside it, one of a messy fort and 4 sleeping children and a man laughing at breakfast. We celebrated a small victory with an impromptu picnic. The house sounded different. Voices overlapped in a way that felt soft instead of harsh. 3 months in, the differences had deepened into routines that felt like roots. The staff had meetings where ideas were proposed. Miguel had organized a weekend workshop in which all caregivers learned about child development and trauma-informed care, with Dr. Chen leading parts of it. Jonas filed adjustments to contracts that strengthened privacy clauses and added a contingency fund for unexpected medical needs. Ava Kendrick attempted to spin a media story about philanthropic innovation and found little traction because our household had refused to be commodified. She offered a partnership again, and Mr. Archer politely declined. He told me he had learned a vocabulary for tenderness and that it frightened him, but that he was tired of living behind walls. The quadruplets began to perform small acts of protection for each other and for me. Jonah left me a cup of water by my bed. Theo drew a treasure map whose X was our kitchen. Nico wrote a tiny play for the staff to perform, and Elias made a crown of leaves for Mr. Archer. My sister Lena came to visit and cried when she saw my mother well and shocked by the soft domesticity of our meals. I signed a paper that allowed for emergency guardianship if something happened to Mr. Archer and felt the oddness of documentation and devotion coexisting. 6 months later, the life we had built felt stable and lived in. The children had a rhythm that allowed for schooling and play and quiet times. Mr. Archer had started a small scholarship fund in his husband's name and hosted a modest event where he read a passage from a book about belonging and the return invested with sincerity. Ava had moved on to other ventures and left the house alone. Miguel had been promoted to director of household operations, and Hannah had a month-long leave she used to travel with her partner. I watched the children at breakfast each morning and felt a steady warmth that was not a surprise anymore. The legal files were in place, the medical bills covered with a safety margin, and my mother had a job at the bakery again on weekends because she liked being busy, and the stitches had left only the memory of a scar. The house was no longer a stage where I performed survival. It was a place we all chose to nurture. We signed a paper that formalized shared guardianship responsibilities and a private agreement that prioritized the children's emotional welfare. On Sundays, we made bread and a house filled with smell of yeast and laughter. Mr. Archer and I had a conversation in which he admitted he had been wrong about 33 nannies and right about one man who could be taught to feel. We had learned to forgive and to promise better. We had named the staff fully: Mrs. Hayworth, the housekeeper; Miguel, the manager; Jonas, the lawyer; Ava Kendrick, the businesswoman; Dr. Chen, the pediatric consultant; Marcus, the groundskeeper; Hannah, the nursery nurse; and Leela, the tutor. Each person had left small marks on our lives, and each had their own reasons for staying. The arc from beginner to family had been slow and stubborn. We found ways to use the shelter of the house to build a proper shelter within the hearts that had once been guarded. We learned to use simple gestures: breakfast shared, a hand on a shoulder, a cup of tea given without comment as language. The final pages of these months were not tidy, but they were honest, and warmed me in a way money never had. If this story makes you hold your breath for a minute and hope for a happy ending, please subscribe. There will be more episodes of people choosing each other and of small mercies that become lifelines. Remember to leave that comment about a time you chose courage and start with "I chose." In the end, I had been hired out of necessity and stayed for love. We signed papers that made the arrangement legal and humane, and learned to count victories in laughter and in the treaties we formed over scraped knees and bad days. The quadruplets, who had once been experiments in testing boundaries, now built forts of blankets and trust. Mr. Archer, who had once measured everything in ledgers, now measured time in pancakes and pages of the books he read aloud. My mother mended and returned to work, Lena studied and found steady hours, and the house no longer felt like a museum. We had traded the dirty currency of fear for a small economy of promises kept. Sometimes the home we look for turns out to be not a building but the people who choose to remain. If this journey touched you, stay with us and keep reading about the ways people rebuild. Remember that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is show up and keep showing up.